So, yeah, obviously want to talk about, we finally got our, our wrap today. I know last week when we had talked, you had mentioned, you would have been surprised if we got a not guilty verdict. How are you feeling today after seeing what we got?
I'm very surprised that two of the defendants were found not guilty on all charges, and there was deadlock on the other two for mistrial. It really is uh, surprising because it seemed like the evidence in this case was very strong. You had two cooperating witnesses of defendants who had already pled guilty. You had text messages, audio recordings, them speaking in their own words about committing this crime. And so one never knows what went into the jury's thinking. We can perhaps hear from some of the jurors later to find out what their rationale was and what persuaded them that the government couldn't make its case in this instance.
So, I know one of the other things too we had talked about last week was the possibility of, if they started to take longer in their deliberations, that leans more to the defense, and it seems like that's exactly what we saw this week.
Correct. The longer the jury was out, the more questions they seemed to have, probably the more doubt was in their minds and the more debates that may have been going on among them. And they just clearly were not persuaded that all of the evidence amounted to guilty verdicts here. They certainly took their time going through the evidence, it appears, and couldn't get to unanimous on finding guilt, even for two of these defendants who were allegedly ringleaders. Apparently, these types of cases are very difficult to get convictions. This is, again, very similar to the Hootery case in the Eastern District of Michigan from about 10, 12 years ago, where that case didn't even get to a jury. The judge decided in that case this was just talk by the defendants. There really was no affirmative substantial steps towards committing a crime, and they might have had an entrapment defense as well. Here, again, there was an entrapment defense made. It's an attempted case, which is always challenging because you have to prove that the defendants took substantial steps toward committing the crime, and rather than allowing the crime to occur. Just shows these cases are very difficult to get a conviction, apparently. But again, it seemed like it was a good effort by law enforcement to infiltrate this group with both undercover FBI agents and confidential informants, and prevented any harm from occurring, even though we're hearing the defense saying, oh, nothing was going to happen anyway, this was just all talk. But it seems like they were taking substantial steps in terms of creating explosive devices and talking about creating explosive devices, planning out their attack, planning to disrupt response times, thinking about what's going to happen after they kidnap the governor, talking about these steps. And so it seemed like there was sufficient evidence for a conviction, but the jury disagreed.
So, for these two guys that had the mistrial, obviously it's possible that those charges can be refiled against them. Do you think that's going to happen?
That's very difficult to predict at this point. I think the U.S. Attorney's Office is going to take a little bit of time here and look at it, assess the case, think about what defects there are. Can those defects be overcome in a second trial in front of a jury? That's going to be their main consideration. Can whatever challenges they had with this jury on any particular issue be overcome in a second trial? And so, given the serious nature of these alleged crimes and kidnapping and potentially murdering a sitting government official like the governor, again, I think that they probably will refile, but again, that's just me sitting outside speculating. That's the decision for the government to make, and they'll do what they think is in the best interest of serving justice.
Um, is there anything, and obviously you, like you mentioned, sitting on the outside of this thing, that for the prosecution, if they did do end up refiling, is there anything that, you would think they would maybe do differently this time around?
It's very hard to second guess the prosecution and its case, and so I don't have. I'm not privy to all of the evidence that was part of the investigation. I don't know what they may have omitted in terms of presenting to the jury. So I really couldn't say whether or not there was something that wasn't done that should have been done or could have been done differently. It's impossible to say.
Yeah, because I mean, I know, like you mentioned, both last weekend today, you said you thought the prosecution did a great job of presenting their evidence.
I thought the prosecution did a very good job of laying out the case, setting it out, the role of each of the defendants, the role that each of them played, the facts supporting the charges in terms of witness testimony, audio testimony, text messages, other evidence of their participation, their steps towards this. Of course, we all saw that probably a weakness is some of the informants that may have had their own legal jeopardy. Informants are not always of the best character and the most credible witnesses, and so that's problematic. But again, when you have two of their co-defendants who were cooperating with the prosecution because they had pled guilty, and you have undercover FBI agents testifying, usually that should be sufficient to persuade a jury, but in this case, it just wasn't.
Great. Well, Pat, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you think is important? Just kind of as we are putting a wrap on everything, here.
Just big picture, I think we all have to agree that whether it's just even talk, and whether it's talk because people say that they're drinking a lot or smoking marijuana or whatever, but talking about violence is wrong, is inappropriate. And especially when we're talking about disagreeing with a political policy and then taking violent action against a person because they are trying to take a political position. We just have to reject that as an American society. And even if there aren't criminal convictions in this instance, we still overall have to respect our democratic processes in America, where it's majority rule. We can always exercise our voices at the ballot box, and just how important it is that everyone exercise their right to vote and not feel so alienated that they want to resort to political violence or even talk about it, much less think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, Pat, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time tonight.
My pleasure.
No, you had a long drive today. Yeah.
Long drive. So this is going to be on at 11?
Yes, 11 tonight.
Okay. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Have a good one.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.